heaven.
Hello and welcome to Who Is Best, a show where I, Claudine, take games that give you choices and rate those choices in a tier list. Also,
Enough is enough! I have had it with these
viewers
on this
channel.
Everybody
Subscribe.
welcome to a set of videos where we will be breaking down the weapons of Elden Ring into tier lists. Today's list will be daggers, straight swords, curved swords, great swords, colossal swords, thrusting swords, heavy thrusting swords, curved great swords, katanas, and twin blades. This will be the longest of the list since swords make up the majority of weapons in this title. Now, as for weapon placement, as I stated in my Bloodborne weapon video, Souls games are all about player ability. The most talented Elden Ring players can make the lowest tier of weapons top tier weapons, but there is some objectivity here, and that's what I seek to focus on today. I also want to point out that through customization with rare items, you can practically change the makeup of some weapons. So we'll try to ignore that fact as it applies to most of the weapons in this list. We'll be judging these weapons off of base stats, range, speed, status build, move set, unique weapon skills, accessibility, and usefulness against the hardest bosses. All of this will be based off of PvE with minor considerations towards PvP. I'll be moving fast through these, but we'll try to stop and give an explanation for any special cases around placement. Oh, and don't forget to stick around till the end for a bonus list. With all that out of the way, let's start this totally not controversial tier list with the tier. Most everything that shows up on the tier is basic weapons that lack any type of build for the endgame. I'm not going to give these much of an explanation, and we'll save that for the upper tiers. First up on the list is the Great Knife, the Simple Dagger, the Long Sword, the Short Sword, Noble's Slender Sword, Weathered Straight Sword, the Urge Steel Dagger, Lord Sworn's Straight Sword, Lord Sworn's Great Sword, Zamora Curved Sword, the Broadsword. Then we have the Ornamental Straight Sword, the Cane Sword, the Rapier, the Troll Knight's Sword, and finally the Knight's Great Sword. Next, we'll move on to the low tier. These are weapons that find slightly more usefulness than the tier, but still struggle to differentiate themselves from the rest. First up is the Frozen Needle, next is the Antspur Rapier, then the Paring Dagger, the Noble's Estoc, the Estoc. Celebrant's Sickle is great in the early game, but quickly loses steam. Two low tier magic blades are the Crystal Knife and the Lazuli Glintstone Sword. Next is the Bloodstained Dagger, Scorpion Stinger, the Twin Blade, Micklin Knight's Sword, Troll's Golden Sword. The Zweinhander is the worst colossal sword in the game and will never be the better choice. Then we have the Gargoyle's Great Sword, Ordovis's Great Sword, Gut's Great Sword, the Dismounter, Magma Worm's Scale Sword, the Shotel, the Bastard Sword, Warhawk's Talon, the Coated Sword, the Iron Great Sword, the Forked Great Sword, the Banished Knight's Great Sword, the Watchdog's Great Sword, the Flowing Curved Sword, Serpent God's Curved Sword, Nox's Flowing Sword, the Flameberg, and finally the worst katana, Dragon Scale Blade. Alright, since we have so many, we're going to split the mid-tier into two parts, so let's start with the lower mid-tier. First up, the Clean Wrought Knight's Sword has pretty terrible scaling for a straight sword. The Golden Epitaph has great scaling for Dex Faith Blade, but has a terrible weapon art. Roger's Rapier is an early game Dex weapon. The Misericord is one of the best straight up daggers if you aren't going for a bleed or magic build. The Shamshir is a decent alternative to many of the upper tier weapons, though it pales in comparison. The Helfen's Steeple's Black Flame ability is useful, but doesn't scale with Faith, making it a slightly awkward weapon. Cinquedea is a decent PvP weapon, but struggles in PvE. The Scimitar and Falchion are both decent curved blades obtained early on. Hand of Melania, seeing as this is the weapon received from the hardest boss in the game and has a capped blood loss, is going to land here in the lower mid tier. Unfortunately, the Grafted Blade, though an epic looking weapon, just doesn't scale as well as other weapons in the late game. The Omen Cleaver is a lesser Bloodhound Fang. The Bandit's Curved Sword, Grossmesser, and Beastman's curved sword are three of the better basic curved blades in the game. Gargoyle's black blade is similar to the Blasphemous blade without the perks. The Sword of Saint Trina is a fun blade to use that unfortunately struggles with damage output. The Godskin Stitcher works well with a shield if you favor a defensive build. The Twin Knight Swords is a damage-heavy weapon that struggles to scale with the late game. The Mantis Blade and Grey EP have incredibly fast movesets. The Ivory Sickle is an above-average weapon with not much more to say about it. The Monk's Flame Blade has a disappointing weapon art. The Onyx Lord's Greatsword, though very powerful, has a very long animation during its weapon art, making you vulnerable. Pre-nerf, the Glintstone Kriss competed for top spot among daggers, but has since fallen from glory. If you're going for a spell sword build, the Crystal Sword and Carrion Knight Sword are a great choice if you've chosen to overlook katanas. The Sword of Milos paired with the Blasphemous Blade is amazing. If not, it sucks. Mirai's Executioner Sword is a strength arcane scaling weapon whose art had obnoxiously long wind-up and recovery time, but if done right, it can do some major damage. The Beastman's Cleaver has a great moveset, but bad scaling. The Regalia of Aelcade is a decent straight sword for the mid-game. Finally, the Alabaster Lord's Sword is a decent choice for a caster build. Alright, that wraps up the lower mid-tier. Let's move on to the upper mid-tier. First up, the Godskin Pillar struggles with damage but can be viable with almost any bleed build. The Magma Blade scales nicely and comes with additional fire damage. Gargoyle's Twin Blade scales more with strength than the Godskin Pillar and might be slightly better. Margot's Cursed Sword has incredible reach and works for most arcane and bleed builds. The Bloody Hellas is a stance-breaking bleed weapon that has a crappy defensive skill which holds it back. On top of being a viable weapon for the late game, the Sacred Relic Sword is also the single best rune farming tool in your arsenal. If you're building a faith build, the Inseparable Sword is one of your best choices. The Scavenger's Curved Sword is one of the best curved swords in the game. The Wakizashi paired with a katana gives you almost all the benefits of a dual-wield katana power stance with parrying and less stamina usage. The Royal Greatsword competes with the Ruin's Greatsword on this list, and I'm not quite sure which one is better, though it seems that Ruin's Greatsword scales better. It's no secret that katanas are a god tier weapon category, and this is no exception for the Serpentine Blade, though it trades bleed for the less effective poison status. The Dragon King's Crag Blade is a god tier PvP weapon and an upper tier PvE weapon. The Gargoyle Black Blade is similar to the Blasphemous Blade, but falls short as BB's weapon art, damage, and utility is much higher. Ruin's Great Sword hits like a truck, and again, might be better than the Royal Greatsword. The Claymore is a solid choice for any playthrough. Malekith's Black Blade is a wholly damaging weapon that has an incredible sweeping weapon art. The Golden Order Greatsword is a great weapon for a faith build, but is overshadowed by Dark Moon and Godslayer Greatswords. The Blade of Calling competes with Black Knife as one of the best daggers in the game, though it lacks many of the debuffs and advantages of the Black Knife, leaving it in the mid tier. Meteoric Ore Blade would beat out many of the other katanas if it had a slightly better weapon art. The top tier. Eleonora's Pole Blade doesn't have insane damage, but more than makes up for it in its incredible bleed build potential. The Nagakiba is the Uchikatana with longer range. The Reduvia and Black Knife are the best daggers in Elden Ring. One is a bleed build god while the other hits with ranged attacks and high crit. If the Black Blade had bleed, it might have made it into the god tier. Though Death's Poker requires an exact build, if followed, it can be devastating. The Eclipse Shotel is the best death weapon in the game and comes with the epic curved sword moveset. The Uchikatana may not be better than the Nagakiba, but you can start the game with it. This is a weapon that is very viable in the late game, making it one of the best choices for newcomers. The Blasphemous Blade is a companion for almost every bleed build, and though on its own is a mid-tier weapon, paired with any bleed weapon, BB practically breaks the game. The Bloodhound's Fang can be obtained early, scales incredibly throughout the entire game, and has an incredibly useful weapon art against large bosses. If you're wanting a weapon to use from beginning to end, don't pass up on this killer blade. The last weapon on top tier is the Godslayer's Greatsword. The Godslayer is one of the fastest greatswords in the game and complements any faith dexterity build. The God tier. The Wing of Astel is one of the best intelligence weapons, and might be the better choice over the Dark Moon Greatsword, with its incredible scaling, fast attacks, and long-range heavy attacks. The Sword of Night and Flame lived through a devastating patch that successfully nerfed the absolutely broken nature of this weapon. It's a testament to this straight sword that despite that, it still lands on the God tier. The Moonveil Katana is one of the single best weapons in the game as it does high damage and you can pick it up relatively early. When compared to its companion Rivers of Blood, Moonveil focuses on stagger and crits while Rivers of Blood is ideal for bleed builds. The Dark Moon Greatsword is no stranger to the Souls-like games and to the God tier of their weapon lists. Decent damage with a long-range weapon skill complements any intelligence build. Also, Rani is the only right choice. Star Scourge Greatsword is as devastating as its previous user. Many of the most powerful builds revolve around dual-wielding these blades, becoming a whirlwind of gravity-enhancing destruction. The final weapon on this list, and single best weapon in the game, is the Rivers of Blood. ROB scales with Arcane and can dish out the fastest and most devastating damage of any weapon in Elden Ring. Despite shadow nerfs from Software, this weapon has continued to prove itself, with it playing a part in some of the most broken builds in the game. And that's my list. Check out our other lists on the remaining weapon types and be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Bonus round. Top 10 coolest looking swords. Number 10, Mirai's Executioner Sword. Number 9, Sword of Milos. Number 8, Beastman's Cleaver. Number 7, Black Knife. Number 6, Dragon King's Cragblade. Number 5, Golden Order Greatsword. Number 4, Coated Sword. Number 3, Hand of Melania. Number 2, Grafted Blade Greatsword. And number 1, the Godslayer Greatsword.